Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending where you're joining from. I can see we have some people from Colombia already, so definitely good morning to you guys. And everyone else, please use the chat, introduce yourselves, introduce your company. Make sure that you tag all panelists, all attendees, so that everyone can see it. And what we're doing here today is we're discussing with Clean Horizon, which is one of those companies that keeps an eye on the market and how things are moving, have these tables and tables of numbers, and are able to give us a really good overview of what's actually going on in the storage industry. And I have to say this is important, right? Because we're hearing so much noise, there is so much talk, so much literature about the potential and the opportunity that batteries has. But another thing is to actually look at it from the lens of what are the actual projects going down, the money flowing there, and this is what we're doing here today. And you know, because you also, I can see there's a bunch of people here who've already known quite well, and there are like friends for a while, and maybe some of you are new, so if you are welcome. You know that we've talked about batteries before. This is nothing new. We've even talked about batteries before with Clean Horizon. And we've talked about a number of things. We talked about the Mexican market, we talked about the MENA market, and we also talked about the worldwide markets. But what is new today is that we are going to discuss grid-connected PV and storage. Grid-connected PV and storage, and this is oftentimes, talked about in the magazines, in articles, but we don't really know how much of this we have going on. And this is why we have Corentin with us today. Corentin, please could you briefly introduce yourself and tell us about your knowledge, your experience?
Hello, everyone. First, thanks, Belen, for introducing me, and thanks for ATA Insight to have Clean Horizon on board for this webinar. So Clean Horizon, we're a consulting company dedicated to energy storage since the company was created back in 2009. So that's 10 years ago. We recently celebrated our 10-year anniversary. We're a team of 8 people based in Paris, and we have an office opened in Miami since last year. And we do 2 things. One is market analysis, and the other one is we're technical consultants, which means we're owner's engineer for energy storage projects. So that's it, very briefly put. And indeed, today we'll discuss PV plus storage.
All right, so excellent. Could you go ahead, share your screen and get ready? Because you know how this works. So it's going to be just a 30-minute section. You're going to get a global debrief on what's going on in the market. And after that, we'll take some questions. Use the Q&A box, not the chat, to send us the questions. And we will take as many as we can. But because this is a fast session, a 30-minute session, we must end in 30 minutes. So go ahead, Corentin.
Great, thanks, Belen. So I kick in directly with the slide. So in the 15 minutes we have, I'll try and show you 4 different, brought up an agenda in 4 different points. First is just giving you an introduction on PV plus storage. Second is about what's happening in the US and the incentives driving storage deployment in the US. Third, you have the PV plus storage deployment outside the US. Oops, sorry, that's a mistake. And then you have the factors influencing the costs of PV and storage. So very brief introduction here. So first, what we call PV plus storage is any storage system connected and co-located with a PV plant. So that's the case. What you can see on this map is the amount of operational and announced energy projects to date. That's from our database of projects. And this is really when the storage system is co-located with PV. So what you can see on this map is that North America is definitely the leading market for PV plus storage, with approximately 4,000 megawatt-hour of battery storage systems announced. So means projects that are likely to be connected in the coming years. And second, which recently kicked in, is Australia, with a massive PV plus storage deployments. And so these two are the two main markets today. You can see that there's a fair bit in Europe, with a couple hundred megawatts of PV co-located with approximately half the capacity in energy storage. And there's also Asia. So in Asia, we're talking about Japan and Korea, essentially for now, and China as well for PV plus storage. Not much happening in Africa, and not much in South America for now. Right, so this is something that's increasingly happening, and that is also due to the fact that storage costs have decreased, thus making the business case for storage coupled with PV more sensible, and the levelized cost of energy more competitive with traditional power plants. Right, so now we've seen US and Australia are the two leading markets. I'll touch on the incentives behind PV plus storage deployment in the US. The main reason for PV plus storage deployment in the US is a mechanism. Well, it's not the only reason, but it's a big driver. It's what is called the investment tax credit, ITC. It's a credit, as the name indicates, that is given to the investor for a PV plus storage project. So here we'll only talk about utility scale projects, and this credit is given to the investor depending on the year at which the project is beginning construction. It's given each year. There's a percentage of the capital expenditure. So essentially it ranges from 30% in 2019, and it starts to decrease from 2019, so the end of this year, and it goes down to 10% in 2022. What's being studied right now in the US is the idea to get this tax credit extended not only to PV plus storage system, but to standalone storage systems. And the condition for PV plus storage system to be to benefit from this investment tax credit is that the storage part is charged at least 75% of the energy from the solar panels. Right, so this is a condition to benefit from this. And what happens is that when the SPV has this tax credit, the investor benefits from it, and they can then use it because the SPV doesn't have that much tax to pay, obviously. So it's going to be the main company that will use the tax credit and give the money back to the SPV. Right, so that was at the state level, the ITC. And now if we look at the state level, there are a lot of initiatives for PV plus storage. There's a AB 2514 in California that requires storage deployment. I won't touch on all of them, but there's also some in Nevada requiring solar plus storage to be part of the IRP. There are free schemes in New York. Puerto Rico has recently launched a very vast plan to get a more resilient network with PV plus storage, resulting in roughly 2 gigawatts of PV and 1 gigawatt of storage planned to be deployed. There's a Sunshot initiative in Texas, which called Science Program, also to aim at having a low LCOE for PV plus storage. So all of these, coupled to the investment tax credits, result in a good incentives to deploy these kind of systems. And that also explains why the US is the first market today for PV plus storage. And most of these projects do shifting because you need 75% of the energy to come from solar. The business case essentially is, well, the battery operation is really load shifting, which is charging the battery during the day and discharging it in the evening. That's also very much the case in California. Right, now if we take a look and take a bit of a step back on PV plus storage, what's happening outside the US? So we mentioned Australia, but we'll take a look at other geographies as well. So what's happening outside the US is mainly that PV plus storage, or storage was a requirement in a couple of geographies to be coupled to PV for two reasons. And the use case here is a bit different. It's one, to respect a forecast, And second, to smooth the output. So respect the forecast. The idea is to make the solar power plant looking more like traditional power plants. That means that it can be forecasted, so that the transmission system operator or the independent system operator can forecast, can plan PV production, which is one of the issues with PV, because it depends on the clouds, of course. So the battery can enable to match a forecast. And second, which is output smoothing. Output smoothing is the fact that if you've ever looked at a PV profile, which I imagine looking at the background of your companies, the PV profile changes a lot on a second or minute per minute basis due to clouds or to changing weather. So these ramps of PV are an issue for the system operator, and storage can enable to smooth this output and ramp PV. So essentially make the PV production less erratic. So there's a couple of geographies here we're looking at. Hokkaido is an island in Japan which had real issues integrating PV, and have set up a requirement, I think it's 3 years ago now, to install storage coupled to the PV power plants so that they get the feed-in tariff. And the requirement was to have 0.7 megawatt of battery per megawatt of PV, and the storage duration required to do the ramp rate control is 30 minutes. In the French islands, which is Guyana, Corsica, Guadeloupe, Martinique, La Réunion, Mayotte, you've got also tenders for PV plus storage. And there's a role of PV plus storage is one, to enable the power plant to match a forecast for the ISO. Second, to ramp PV. And third, to shift part of the production to the night. So the requirement is to install half the PV capacity in batteries in 1 hour. If we look then at South Korea, their storage is not mandatory, but there is a big incentive for storage to be coupled with PV. The idea, and it's what's explained below, is that what's remunerated by the South Korean government is the fact that you can shift part of the PV production to the evening, and they give you renewable energy certificates. The equivalent, if you guys are familiar with the UK ROCs, it's called RECs in South Korea, but you get 3.8 RECs for 1 megawatt hour of solar plus storage instead of 1 REC if you get storage on it, if you get solar on its own. And then you get a lot of islands that have installed PV plus storage for microgrid stabilization. So that's true for a couple of islands in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Ocean, so which is a mix of ramp rate and reserve, essentially replacing spinning reserves. Right. Here, I'm just pointing out something else that's driving PV plus storage deployment worldwide, and mostly in developing countries or emerging economies, as we call them. It's development finance institutions. So that means World Bank, the AFD, the French Agency for Development. That means the American Interdevelopment Bank. A European Development Bank, all of these banks, the African Development Bank, all of these banks fund projects that more and more have PV plus storage. The reason for that is that the grids in emerging economies are often fragile, and it's difficult for them to cope with big power plants that have an intermittent production. That's the reason why you get these programs that have in the procurement a storage component. And here we show a couple. So there's USTDA, there's Scaling Solar from Madagascar. So a couple of these RFPs from the funders which have a storage component. As you might know, the World Bank recently launched a $1 billion fund for battery storage investment. That's, for instance, in South Africa, is going to be the test bed of this program, but there's going to be other states. And Scaling Solar is, of course, now set to always almost incorporate a storage component in the future. So that's definitely an area to track if you guys are developers or if you guys are looking at developing PV plus storage plans. So it's the DFIs. Here I'm going to, so we mentioned incentives, we mentioned development DFIs. Now I'm going to tackle projects that are more on a commercial basis, so merchant PV plus storage projects. What I'm saying here is not that the US projects are not merchant-based, because they are, but they do have heavy incentives. There are also some plans that are PV plus storage but are purely merchant-based. In this case, you have, what's the rationale behind it? First, if you're a developer and you have a PV power plant, you already have the connection, you already have the land, so it doesn't cost much more to add a storage component on the land. The footprint of storage is not much compared to PV, so you probably have enough room for storage, and the operation of storage doesn't need to be coupled with the PV operation. I'll touch on this for a second because this is important. You can have a PV plus storage plant for which there is absolutely no interaction between the storage component and the PV component. It doesn't mean if you have on the same side the two different assets that they operate jointly. I'll illustrate this. You have, for instance, in Germany and in France, two projects here. So the one in Azure and the one in Neuhardenberg, which have co-located PV and storage, but the storage power plants has an operation which is gated by frequency regulation. So it's called frequency containment reserve. It's in the UK, it's called FFR, well, it's frequency regulation. So it's not integrating, properly speaking, PV, even though when you provide frequency regulation, you increase network stability, and thus you improve, you enable more renewable penetration, but it's not the first goal. So these projects simply benefit from the interconnection and the space to add storage to existing projects. And these are merchant-based, which means that the battery storage system makes money either on the capacity market via frequency regulation or by selling electricity from the grid or to the grid. There's also a last way to monetize PV plus storage system, which is increasingly developing, which is still fresh in Europe but happening elsewhere, which is PPAs. So that can be more often we see corporate PPAs coming into for these projects. So it is essentially the idea is to sell electricity not only during the day but also for PPAs at night. So shifting part of this electricity. Right. So as I said, we'll try and keep it short. We're already at almost done. 2 slides more to go. What I'll try and highlight in these last sections is how the business case is different from a country to another and why it's different. Why you can't compare the LCOE of a PV storage power plant in the US to one in Australia to one in Europe. And here, what I only tackle is the power plants that have PPAs or feed-in tariffs worldwide. What you can see on this slide is the cost of energy of PV plus storage projects. So that's equivalent to the LCOE. Well, that's what we estimate. So depending on the project, either it's the price of the PPA when we have the PPA, so when it's public. Otherwise, it's an estimation based on the incentives the project has and based on the cost and the irradiation of how much the projects cost. So it's a LCOE in the end. So you can see it's in USD per megawatt hour that you have on the y-axis, and on the x-axis it's the plant commissioning date. So the trend wouldn't be surprising for most of you. It's going down. So the LCOE of PV plus storage is going down. Great news. That's why we have more and more projects, and that's why it's more and more competitive with traditional generation. Also, what you can see is that as we go, projects are going bigger and bigger. The project size is represented here by the size of the circle, and the storage duration depends a lot on the projects, on what you're doing. So, for instance, if you look at Hokkaido. Here, or we can't see, I think it's below, but if you look at, I mentioned duration, the French island, it's roughly 1 hour. In Hokkaido, it's a bit less. So it changes a lot from a place to another. And you can see now LCOE going as low as 45, 50 USD, and here we even have 30, I think, USD per megawatt hour. Right. That's my last slide, which is now what we've done is that we've computed the business case and we've looked at the costs due to the storage part or due to the PV part for one typical 100 megawatt PV, 25 megawatt, 100 megawatt hour of storage globally. And what changes from a region to another is one, the incentives. So you can see the USA has the lowest LCOE or the lowest cost of energy thanks to the investment tax credit, which reduces your capex of 30%, which is huge. Then you have Europe, which has, so the cost is a bit higher because there's a bit less solar radiation and there's not the ATC. Australia has a higher radiation. So we've done a bit, there's also in this, we've computed the cost of financing. So there's also the project risks. That's why Africa has a higher cost, because financing this type of projects is more complicated. So you're likely to get more expensive capital to finance, and system costs. So that's it. The idea here is to show everyone that you can't really compare your projects, wherever be it in the world, in terms of PPA to others, because the radiation, the system costs, the incentives will change from a country to another, and so it shouldn't be compared that way. Also, you can see that the storage component is often relatively low from the whole project perspective, and that's mostly because we only have 25 megawatt of project, 25 megawatt of storage for 100 megawatt of PV. So that also makes a difference. Right, so that's pretty much it for my slides. Now I'm happy to take questions, of course. If you don't have time to send questions now, feel free to contact me afterwards. I'm happy to discuss a bit more on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Corentin. Actually, we have 4 questions. Some others have already, I think, been answered as we were going through. So for everybody to know, you will get recordings, you will get the presentations after the event. Stop sharing, just stop sharing your screen at the top so that we can see. And we'll begin with the questions at the top. You can press stop sharing. Yeah, here we go. So first is my question, and my question to you would be, what mechanisms are you seeing that are the most efficient in terms of driving up the industry quickly and cheaply, and to get it to like a decent LCOE? So what are you seeing, and what are the best policies, if you like, or whatever else?
So from what we can see, a good policy, well, there's probably a couple of things. First, if there's an incentive for PV plus storage, well, it's good. It only drives more business if you get a tax rebate. Also, but actually now, as the cost of PV and storage decrease, the business case is becoming more and more easy to find. So there's a lot more projects. So probably what's very important is to have the regulatory framework. So the ability for people to sell, to get the PPAs, to get the legal framework to sell electricity to the independent system operator or to the utility if it's a country which is vertically integrated, And what's key here for these countries to sign these PPAs is, of course, either the renewable roadmap or the obligation for the utility to reduce its operational costs. So that's something we've seen in a couple of countries where the utility needs to be transparent and has to report its cost of electricity. And when this is done, very often PV plus storage cost is below the utility marginal cost. So there's always a couple of power plants you can remove which are the most costly thanks to PV plus storage.
Okay, and now we have 4 questions. Hopefully we'll answer them all. A few you've already been sort of answering, but there was one about cost, LCOE, and then your slide comes in and I'm like, yeah. All right, so.
Okay, so I'll start with the first one, Belén,
Yeah.
I see, is from one.
Are you talking about battery only, yeah, or
Yes,
are considering
okay, so
all storage technology?
in my slides, on the slides we have, it's based on our database of projects. And all the projects you can see here are energy storage projects. Technologies are undifferentiated. The only thing is all projects are larger than 500 kilowatts. So you don't see the residential and commercial projects on these slides, but you have all types of systems. So of course, batteries represents a large share, but there's also any other types of technology except pumped hydro, which are not shown.
And thermal, right? Solar thermal.
Thermal storage, yeah, but thermal storage is not what we consider as electricity storage. A lot of thermal storage doesn't go back to electricity most of the time. So there's today very few sites that it's really electricity storage.
When regulators specify a storage duration, do they accept nameplate performance, or do they mandate that the storage duration is maintained despite capacity degradation? That's quite a question.
Yes, so very good question. So actually, it really depends. So if I look, when it's mandatory, I think of Japan, I think of the French islands, I think of a couple of other countries, but essentially, the duration is never mandatory because otherwise, I mean, what's mandatory is there's a rule you sign in the PPA which says the ramp of your total PV plus storage power plant needs to be below 1% of the nameplate PV power. So if you get per minute, so if you get a 10 megawatt, 100 megawatt PV power plant, the ramp cannot be, in the example I took, which is effective, 1 megawatt per minute. So you'll have to size your energy storage system properly to ensure that you manage these constraints. And of course, it's your job to do that. The operator won't look at what you installed, but when the developer do the simulation, or we do the simulation for them on the battery sizing, we realize, depending on the constraints, how long the battery needs to be. So for Hokkaido, to manage the constraints from the grid operator, which is a ramp rate control and there's a bit of voltage regulation, we realized by running the simulation that the battery duration only needs to be less than an hour, and the ratio is 0.7 megawatt per megawatt of PV. So that's not specified, to answer very clearly, it's not specified by the operator, the duration and the nameplate. What happens is you do the job as long as you ensure that you meet the requirements. And it's by doing the simulation that you happen finding the requirements.
Okay, in rapid fire, because we are about to finish.
Yes.
We might not be able to take the 3. Okay, let's see. Is the 200 megawatt PV and storage operational in South Africa? Is it operational, or has it just been announced? And I think you're referring to the ESCOM project.
Yeah, it's ESCOM project, so it's announced so far, and that's part of the whole plan of the World Bank plan in PV plus storage. So it's announced. I mean, the plan was to install it by the end of this year, but it was too ambitious, so it won't be. It's probably going to be sometime next year.
Another question here says Jordan is a sunny country, has a significant amount of solar PV. But don't you feel like there is uncertainty with the grid capacity and uncertainty in the regulations surrounding renewable energy projects, and that therefore deters investments on solar plus storage?
So in terms of I'm not sure I actually get this question. It's
So
not
it says
sure.
it's sunny, you know, there is a need for the grid, but don't you feel like the uncertainty in the grid capacity coupled with the uncertainty in the regulation for renewable energy projects deters investment?
Okay, so good question. Yes, for sure, it's always helpful to have the good to have the very good visibility on the PV on the projects of the operator on the regulatory side for further uptake. That's definitely key. So when there is the good regulatory framework for this. When there's the ability for power plants to sell their electricity in locations where the electricity price is expensive, which is the case very much in islands or in remote places where it's diesel fired, it's competitive. So I think the regulatory framework is important, but the business case is getting there. So we'll see that coming anyways.
Okay, now there is a complicated question. This is the last question. We're not going to take any more because we need to go. And it says, it's quite a complex one. It's someone that is making calculations and it says that they don't add up. But the question comes down to one thing here. It says the weight of the cost of the storage should be about 30 to 40% of the LCOE, correct? I think the figures in the graph were less.
Yes, so we compute less. So how about Isaac, we take these questions. How about you either mail it to me and I take a quick look. So actually what shows here, it's not only on the CapEx, it's on the whole project life. So I think we consider, so there's a battery replacement at some point. We consider these projects to be on 10 years, or on 20 years. So you need to replace the battery half year. In terms of CapEx, just looking at it, if you get 50 megawatt, that's roughly 25 million. And if you have 100 megawatt, it's probably 100 million. So I'd say it's more about 20% doing the math like this. But happy to chat, to look at this.
Yeah, he said okay.
Okay, great.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I'm sorry that we don't have time for more. We do have more webinars today and any other day, so come join us. And for today, thank you very much, Corentin, for answering all our questions.
Thank you, Belen.
Giving us such interesting market information. See you next time, guys.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.
Bye.